It was a night like any other, the kind that felt ordinary in the chaos of everyday life. Yet for Maria, it was anything but. She sat at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, glancing down at the letter she had just received. The words blurred as she ran her fingers over them again, trying to make sense of what seemed almost unreal. A wealthy businessman, a millionaire named Richard Gray, had just offered her an unimaginable opportunity to bathe him as part of an exclusive wellness treatment. It sounded insane, but there was more to the offer than just the unusual request. The money she could only dream of, was enough to secure her son's future. For a single mother like Maria, who had spent years juggling multiple jobs just to keep the lights on and food on the table, this was a chance she couldn't ignore. But why would a millionaire ask a stranger to bathe him? The offer raised more questions than it answered. Was there something sinister behind it? Was she walking into a trap? The thought of what this man, whose name was whispered among the elite, wanted from her lingered in her mind. Yet, her son's health, her son's future, was at stake. He needed an operation, one that their insurance wouldn't cover. The weight of his future was enough to push Maria past any hesitation. And with trembling hands, she picked up the phone. Richard Gray's voice was calm, reassuring even, as he explained the details. He was looking for someone trustworthy, someone who understood the delicate balance of care he required. Maria had no idea what she was getting herself into, but with every word he spoke, she felt the tight grip of desperation loosening its hold. What was one night of bizarre service for $1 million opportunity? The money would change everything. Her son's medical bills, his dreams, his life. It was all worth it, or was it? The next evening, Maria stood in front of the mansion, her heart racing, as she stared at the grand gates. The house was silent, its towering presence intimidating. She had been here before, just never in these circumstances. As she stepped into the lavish foyer, the overwhelming scent of expensive cologne mixed with the sterile scent of wealth. The walls were adorned with priceless artwork, the floors polished to a perfect shine. But none of this compared to the man who awaited her. Richard Gray wasn't what she expected. He wasn't some high-powered businessman wrapped in arrogance. He was almost fragile, sitting in a luxurious chair in a room filled with soft lighting. His eyes met hers, and there was something in them, something that made her question whether she was making a mistake. "I'm glad you came," he said, his voice low but soothing. "I trust you'll make this a memorable experience." Maria stood frozen for a moment, not sure how to react. The whole situation was surreal, and as she took another step forward, the door behind her closed with a soft click. She was now in this strange, unfamiliar world, alone with the man who held the key to everything she needed. The man, however, wasn't just looking for something material. There was a strange power he held over the situation, and Maria couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her every move. She glanced over at him, trying to calm her nerves. His demeanor didn't fit the eccentricity of the request. It was almost as if he wasn't just hiring someone for a service. There was an odd vulnerability behind his eyes, and that vulnerability felt more powerful than anything she had ever experienced. As she prepared to start, Maria couldn't help but wonder, what would happen next? Would she get what she came for? Or would she fall into something darker, something beyond her control? As the evening unfolded, nothing could prepare her for the unexpected twist that would change everything. But as she stepped closer, about to start the strange ritual that had been promised to her, something in the air shifted. The tension in the room grew palpable, and Maria felt her pulse quicken. There was more to this than she could ever have imagined. What she didn't know was that her decision, made out of desperation and a mother's love, was about to lead her down a path where nothing would be as it seemed. The night was far from over, and the real story was just beginning. And as the door clicked shut behind her, locking her into the unknown, Maria could only wonder, was this really the answer to her problems? Or had she just opened the door to something much more dangerous? As Maria stood in the center of Richard Gray's dimly lit living room, the weight of her decision began to settle in. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. She glanced around, taking in the opulence of her surroundings. Every piece of furniture screamed luxury, but there was an emptiness to it all, almost as if the house itself was hollow. A shell filled only with the possessions of a life that had long lost its meaning. This was a world she knew nothing about, and yet, here she was, walking deeper into it by the second. Richard sat across from her, his eyes still fixed on her, as if searching for something. It was unsettling. His calm exterior made it hard to read his intentions, but Maria knew better than to trust appearances. He may have seemed fragile, but there was something unsettling about the way he watched her. She was just a means to an end, a solution to his own private problem, whatever that may be. But she couldn't focus on that now. She had her own fight to win. Her son's health, his future, depended on her pushing forward. She had to take this chance, no matter how bizarre or uncomfortable it felt. Richard's voice broke the silence, warm and polite. "Please, make yourself comfortable. I understand this is a bit unconventional, but I assure you the benefits will be worth it. You won't regret it." His words were smooth, rehearsed almost, like he had used them before on others. But Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was only one part of a much bigger picture, a picture she was yet to fully understand. She nodded quietly, taking a seat on the edge of the plush sofa, trying to steady her nerves. Her son's face flashed in her mind, his small, innocent smile, as he played with his toys at home, blissfully unaware of the lengths she was willing to go to in order to give him a chance at life. The operation he needed wasn't something they could afford on their own. The insurance would barely cover a fraction of the cost. But here was Richard, offering a solution she could never have imagined. All she had to do was accept the strange, unsettling job. She let out a slow breath, focusing on the task at hand. She had to stay composed. She wasn't just a mother. She was a fighter, and this was just one more challenge to overcome. Richard continued speaking, but his words felt distant now, like a murmur in the background of her thoughts. She was already lost in the haze of her own internal struggle, weighing the costs and benefits in her mind. The money was the immediate solution, but what would the long-term consequences be? Was there a hidden agenda behind Richard's request? Could she really trust him? As she lost herself in her thoughts, Richard's voice once again broke through. "I know this might be hard to understand, but sometimes we have to go through unconventional means to fix what's broken." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with a strange intensity. "I need someone who's unaffected by the usual norms, someone who can see beyond the surface. That's why I chose you." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. The way he said, "someone who's unaffected," made it sound as though he had handpicked her for this task. But why? What was it about her that made her the right choice? Was it her desperation? Her willingness to do anything for her son? She wasn't sure, but she knew she couldn't back down now. Not when she was so close to securing a future for him. Richard stood up slowly, walking toward the large windows that overlooked the city skyline. The soft glow of the streetlights below cast long shadows on the room. "I'll be honest with you, Maria," he said, his voice now quieter, almost a whisper. This is not just a simple task. There are certain elements involved that require a level of trust, even understanding. What we're about to do is not something anyone can walk away from unchanged. Maria's heart skipped a beat. What was he saying? Was this more than she had bargained for? Her mind raced, but she kept her composure. She couldn't afford to second-guess herself now. Richard turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. I've lived a life of excess, of power. I've seen everything this world has to offer. But there's a part of me that's broken, and only someone like you can fix it. His eyes were almost pleading now, vulnerable in a way that didn't match the $1 million mansion or the life of luxury he had built. It was a vulnerability that sent a shiver through her. Maria couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Was this really about helping her son? Or was there something else going on? She had never imagined herself in a position like this, caught between the promise of wealth and the fear of losing herself in the process. Every step she took seemed to lead her deeper into a web of uncertainty. But then, just as she was about to voice her concerns, a soft knock on the door interrupted them. A servant entered, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of water. Richard gestured for her to take one, but Maria hesitated. There was something about the way the servant's eyes flicked nervously between them that made her stomach twist. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was being watched, that she was being pushed further into something she didn't fully understand. As she reached for the glass, a sudden realization hit her. What if this was all a test? What if Richard wasn't looking for someone to bathe him, but for someone to reveal his own brokenness, his own humanity, something he had long since buried beneath layers of wealth and power? Maria couldn't deny that there was a part of her that was tempted to help him, to uncover whatever it was he was hiding. But she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to handle what that might mean. With the glass in her hand, she took a deep breath, preparing herself for whatever came next. The night was far from over, and as much as she tried to prepare herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than she could ever have imagined. The deeper she went, the more she realized that the lines between right and wrong, good and bad, were becoming increasingly blurry. And the more she stayed in Richard's world, the more she feared she might lose herself along the way. As she sipped the water, she caught a glimpse of Richard, watching her closely, his gaze unwavering. She could feel the tension building in the air, like a storm waiting to break. What would happen when the storm finally hit? And more importantly, would she be able to weather it? As Maria slowly lowered the glass, her mind was in overdrive. The cool water did little to calm her nerves. If anything, it made her feel more disconnected, as though she were floating in some surreal dream she couldn't wake up from. She watched Richard, his intense gaze never leaving her, as he stood across from her with his calm, unsettling demeanor. He didn't seem like the type of man to be vulnerable, at least not in the way she expected. And yet, there was something in his eyes that felt like an invitation, an opening for her to discover something buried deep within him. She could feel the tension growing, like a string pulled too tight, waiting to snap. What was he really after? Why had he chosen her? And more importantly, what was the real purpose behind this strange, bizarre ritual? Before she could ask another question, Richard took a step toward her, his voice low and almost urgent. Maria, you've been chosen for more than just this task. You are here because you have something that no one else does. You've faced hardship, pain. You fought for your son. I've been watching people all my life, waiting for the one who would understand me, and I believe you are the one. Maria's chest tightened, her pulse quickening as she tried to process his words. Was this some kind of manipulation? Was he trying to make her feel special so she wouldn't back out, or was there truth to what he was saying? She had been struggling for so long. Her life had been nothing but a series of challenges, and she had fought through each one with her son's future as her anchor. Could it be that Richard was offering something more than money? Or was this all a game? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, soft at first, but growing louder. It was a tapping at the door. Maria turned, half expecting the servant to return, but instead, it was the sound of something more ominous. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. Richard's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing. There was a look in his gaze now, something darker. It was as though the vulnerability he had shown earlier was a mask, and now it was slipping away. "Stay here," Richard said sharply as he moved toward the door. "Don't leave, whatever happens. Don't leave this room." Maria's heart raced. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out before things took a dangerous turn. But there was something compelling about the situation, something about Richard's urgency that made her hesitate. She stayed where she was, watching the door as Richard slowly approached it. When the door opened, it wasn't a servant who walked in. It was a tall, imposing figure, dressed in dark clothes, their face obscured by a mask. Maria gasped, but before she could react, Richard stepped forward, speaking in a tone that was unfamiliar to her, filled with authority. "It's time." The figure nodded and stepped aside, revealing what lay beyond. Maria's eyes widened as she saw what she hadn't been prepared for. The room was not what it appeared to be. Behind the door, there was an underground passage, dimly lit and winding downward. It was like something out of a thriller movie. The kind of thing you never expect to be real until you're standing right in the middle of it. Richard turned back to her, his face a mixture of resolve and something darker. "This is the next step, Maria. What you came here for isn't just about money. It's about understanding, about crossing into a world you've never seen before." Maria felt the ground shift beneath her, both literally and figuratively. What had started as a strange, almost ridiculous job had now turned into something she could no longer control. The stakes had grown higher, and her sense of safety had crumbled. But as she stood there, something inside her stirred. She had come this far for her son. She couldn't stop now. With a deep breath, Maria followed Richard down the narrow passage, each step bringing her closer to whatever this was. As they descended, the air grew colder, the tension palpable. She had no idea where this path would lead, but she knew one thing: whatever happened next, she was in it now. The promises of money, the chance to save her son, all of it was slipping into the background. What mattered now was the truth of this strange world Richard had pulled her into. At the bottom of the stairs, they reached a dimly lit chamber, and there, in the center, was a strange object, something that looked almost like a ceremonial pedestal, surrounded by intricate symbols and designs. The air felt charged, as if something powerful was about to happen. Maria's pulse quickened as Richard turned to her, his expression unreadable. "This is where it ends," he said softly, "and where it begins. I'm sorry you had to be part of this, but I couldn't keep living a lie. And now you'll see the truth." Maria stood frozen, unsure of what was happening. She wanted to run, but her legs felt heavy. And just as she was about to ask Richard to explain, a sudden force gripped her, pulling her closer to the pedestal. And then it hit her, the reality of what she was truly a part of. Richard wasn't offering her just money. He had been using her, playing her from the very start. All this time, he had been testing her, manipulating her emotions, pushing her to cross a line she hadn't even realized was there. The $1 million offer, the strange ritual, It had all been part of his game. A game she hadn't fully understood until now, with the realization crashing down on her. Maria knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to play along anymore. She wasn't going to be part of his twisted world. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the stone floor, the sound echoing in the chamber as she raced back toward the stairs. Richard's voice called after her, but it was too late. Maria had crossed a line, and she was determined not to let him control her anymore. The room behind her was silent, the only sound her rapid breathing. She had fought for her son, and she wasn't going to let this be the price. When she finally burst through the door and back into the main house, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had escaped, but not without a price. The money she had come for, the chance to save her son. Those promises were now distant memories, replaced by the understanding that some things in life weren't worth the cost. As she drove away from Richard's mansion, Maria's thoughts were filled with one question. How much of herself had she been willing to sacrifice for a future she didn't truly understand? She didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. The real battle was just beginning. Oh, Minnie,